Hey, welcome. We're going to do an editing session today. Nothing too out of the ordinary or extraordinary, and all we're really going to do is just edit a voiceover. I just recorded, and now it needs to be fixed up. All my little outtakes are in there, and gaps and places where maybe I'll decide that it wasn't good enough and I'll want to push a little bit of a different style in. So we're going to just start right from the beginning of a simple training narration on safety around operating cranes in an industrial workplace. That's all this is today. But if you're interested in knowing more about editing, maybe you're kind of new to that part of it, and you want to see what I do, and I can only show you what I do, here we go. So I have up on the screen for you the actual voiceover. I use a very simple program called Twisted Wave. I do not normally edit with headphones. I just normally edit through speakers, but because of the way we have to be set up here for recording this feed, I have to listen through headphones. Otherwise, a little noise kind of echoes and repeats back into the microphone from the speakers, and we get a small amount of reverb. So just for the purposes of doing the special feed today, I'm actually going to use headphones. And so now we're going to listen a little bit, and I'm just going to follow along on the copy, which is right here. All right, so here we go. The crane maintenance 5 columns on Turnium will serve you as a guide to perform your work safely. If you comply with the procedures, do not take any shortcuts, and support yourself on our pillars, you will contribute to generate a safer place for you, your colleagues, and everyone who works at the company. The 5 columns are: 1. Preparation and authorization. 2. Access to overhead crane. 3. Tasks on board. Tasks on board the overhead crane. There's the first outtake. 3. Tasks on board. And I would not do all this zooming. I'm going to do it mainly for your benefit, but I just want to show you how this gets cut. What I do is I start from the beginning, the exact beginning of the good new take, and I edit back to the exact beginning of the outtake. By doing it that way, all the gap for breath and natural pause is left in. Okay, so all I do is select that and delete it. 3. Tasks on board the overhead crane. 4. Post-maintenance tests. 5. Crane authorization and submit to operational area. Okay, this C right here is a little hard. It's not popped. It's not, really that one's not a problem. But what I'm going to do is to just pull it back a little bit. I have set a hotkey in my editor for the letter F, which actually equates to amplify. I can't remember now why I chose F to start with, but it's written into rote memory now, so that's what I use. So I've got it set to -1, so that way I can do quick fine-tuning adjustments of volume. So I'm just going to go F-enter a few times, like that, just to bring it down. 5. Crane authorization. That was too much, so I'm undoing a couple. 5. Crane authorization. Here we are. And submit to operational area. Okay. Preparation and authorization. Are you fit, both physically and emotionally, to access the overhead crane? If you are not in condition to access the crane, don't do it. Refuse the task and notify your supervisor immediately. Do you have the required paperwork? Make sure that you know and carry with you the mandatory. Make sure that you know and carry with. And what I can do in order to stop it right at the play marker, right where the marker is shift space, is what I use on Twisted Wave, my editor. So I'm just going to pull it back. You'll see there is the breath and the space. And we don't want to lose the breath or the space. You see there's the breath right there, that little caterpillar. And there's a space after the breath, which is critical. If you cut that out, you get a really weird effect. So we want to leave that in. So we want to go right from the very beginning of the bad take to right at the very beginning of the good take. And then I'm just going to hit delete, and it'll sound nice and natural. Make sure that you know and carry with you. And that was another outtake. Make sure that you. Now, there's a neat thing in this. I'll just run ahead to be absolutely sure. Yeah, there was only the one other outtake. So there's a neat feature in this where I can just grab this arrow right here and pull. And what it does is it pulls it over, and we can pull it right to the beginning of the next good take. Paperwork. Make sure that you know and carry with yourself the mandatory paperwork before accessing the crane. Always remember to carry your lock. Do you have all the required personal protection elements? Always check before starting a task if you need any specific protection element. Once in the area, contact the person in charge and request the authorization to begin the task. Sometimes you can see a peak like that and it's really not a problem. So it isn't always necessarily a popped P. It can just be a little bit of a volume spike, and unless it's really aggressive, sometimes it can be just fine. I had the mic a little too close when I was doing this, so that's the reason why we're even seeing any of that. Normally there's none of it, and I don't use, as you'll see here, a pop filter at all. It's just I use the angle of the mic to prevent the problem with pop Ps. Okay, so let's keep going. Task. Always carry with you the required paperwork and never start a task without the corresponding authorization. I added Recognize and identify the specific risks of the area. Occasionally, if they do shorthand like that and I put, say, like an in, I assume that it's not going to be a problem for them. It never has been, really, so that kind of thing I don't worry about. A correct risk analysis will guarantee that you take all the necessary control measures. Are you ready to complete a correct risk? I jumped ahead a little just to be sure there was only the one outtake there. Now we'll zoom in. A correct. We'll take it all the way back to just at the edge of that, still leaving the breath and the space. Delete. A correct risk analysis will guarantee that you take all the necessary control measures to mitigate them. Are you ready to complete the paperwork? Are you responsible? Are you ready? I didn't like how I had said that, so I did say it again. Are you ready to complete the paperwork? You are responsible for filling in the paperwork. Take your time to do it correctly. Remember the preparation and authorization pillars. If you are not in condition to access the crane, don't do it. Refuse the task and notify your supervisor immediately. One thing about corporates is it's so easy to become too corporate, and lose the humanity. And I think that when people are training, especially, they're already nervous. So we don't want to get too formal and too stiff with them. So I try to keep a certain amount of personality and a certain amount of just humanity in the read, even when it's corporate and especially when it's training or e-learning. You should have all the required paperwork before accessing the crane. Before accessing the crane. Now there was a little motion somewhere in the house. If I can normalize that, and you'll hear it. That right there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just reduce it. I've got a filter that I use. Crane. It's still there a little bit. I'm just going to hit silent S for that little tiny bit. What you don't want to do is just suck all of the room noise out from between every little gap. But occasionally I will go ahead and just mute a very small passage like that. It's just quicker and easier, and I really don't think it's noticeable. Where it does become noticeable is every time the voice stops, it sounds like you fell off the end of the earth, this real dead silence. Before starting a task, make sure that you have all the basic and specific personal protection elements. I think there was what I would call a gasp for breath there. I leave breaths, but if it's one that I just had to put in because I ran out of air, sometimes I'll take that out. In that case, what I do is I'll select, right, we've got to leave that K, that right there. So just after that, I'm going to select the entire thing. I'm going to mute it, just S on my keyboard, and then I'm going to back the selection off just slightly because we don't want to leave the entire space of a breath. A breath is longer than a normal pause would be. So I'm going to take out most of that, more than half. And what we end up with is specific personal protection elements. See, that's nice and natural. Once in the sector, notify the manager and request authorization to begin the task. Recognize and identify the specific risks of the area. Take your time to fill in the paperwork correctly. We invite you to continue learning about Pillar 2, Access Overhead Crane. Access overhead crane. You should always wear the safety harness. Remember that you should be correctly wearing the harness before accessing the crane. Are you properly accompanied to carry out the... Okay, here's a good little thing. You hear that right in there? I don't know if we're going to be able to get this one or not, but yeah, there it is. You see that little piece of barbed wire right there? That little deal right there? That's a little mouth noise thing. I'm going to go back out so you can hear it again. Are you properly... Hear that little click? Okay. That's just that little piece of barbed wire there. I can select that. And that might be too... It's snapping to the nearest waveform. So we'll have to see whether that's going to be too much or not. And just silence that much. It's a very, very tiny little sample right there. But if we listen now, are you properly accompanied to carry? It's gone. See that? We just got rid of that little tiny piece of barbed wire, and it got rid of that little click in the middle of a mouth click that appears in the clear, like when you're moving your mouth before you start talking again in areas like this. My mouth click filter, the RX thing, Isotope, does a good job on that. But I think that sometimes when it's right in the middle of a sentence, it can be harder for the software maybe to pull that out. So I've discovered that if you zoom way in, see like I did right there, you can see there's the spot right there. You can literally just mute out a tiny, tiny area, and it's enough to take care of the click. But because it's such a small sampling of the overall sound, you don't hear it as missing. There's no audible gap. Are you properly accompanied to carry out the task? See? Never access on your own to perform an Okay, again here I'm just gonna pull that in pretty tight there. Your own to perform an intervention in a crane. Respect and comply the procedure for accessing the crane. Accessing the crane. Now, to me, that felt a little hard. For accessing the crane. So I'm just going to put my cursor here, and I'm going to just say that part again. For accessing the crane. For accessing the crane. For accessing the crane. There, that C was less hard. Crane. And I think I'm just going to take the C. You can edit up against a consonant really well. Accessing the crane. See, there we go. That's pretty good. Accessing the crane. That was too tight. Accessing the crane. There, that's natural and good. So all I did there was I just recorded a little bit of the phrase, but ultimately I just stole just the word crane off of there. Respect and comply the procedure for accessing the crane. And then we got a long gap. Let's see what's going on here. Wait until the crane's operator comes down. Yeah, all right, that's all that is. So I'm just going to pull that up. Accessing the crane. Wait until the crane's operator comes down looking for you to access together. Accessing the crane through the usual access. Always respect the procedures for accessing the overhead crane and use the usual access. I have no idea what that means, but we'll just leave it how it is. Check if the visualized risks match. Check if the visual... Okay, so we'll pick it up here. Check if the visualized risks match the description in the paperwork, OT. Before starting a task, go over your paperwork to validate that you have considered all the risks. Make sure that the required lockouts indicated in the paperwork have been made. Before starting a task, always check that the required lockdowns in the paperwork have been made. Remember the overhead crane access main pillars. 1. You should always wear your safety harness. 2. Make sure to be properly accompanied to carry out an intervention in a crane. 3. Respect and comply the access procedure of the crane. 4. Always access through the usual access. Always access. That gap seemed a little long, so I'm just going to pull that back a bit. Always access through the usual access. Check if the visualized risks match the ones described in the paperwork. Before starting a task, check that the lockdowns indicated in the paperwork have been made. We invite you to continue learning about Pillar 3, tasks on board the overhead crane. Okay, I'm going to stop it there. There's still more than half left, and I'm not going to put you through all of that. But those were a lot of the basics. Pulling out outtakes by editing from the very beginning of the outtake to the very beginning of the good take and just deleting. That will leave the natural gap and the breath and everything as it is. If you're editing up to a breath, make sure to leave the breath and the natural space after a breath. Usually when we talk, we go, then we say something. So there's the, and then there's a slight gap, and then we speak. So leave that gap in there, otherwise it sounds very unnatural. If you have a little mouth noise in the middle of a sentence, you can zoom way in on the waveform, and you'll see something that looks like a little spike of barbed wire there. And what you can do is zoom way in, select just that, and just mute it. It's S or M or whatever you've got. M is usually marker, but S or whatever you have set up on your keyboard for mute will mute just that little tiny bit of the waveform. And in most cases, not all the time, but in most cases, it will take that out without any noticeable gap, and all you'll lose is that little juicy mouth noise in there. Okay, so a few little thoughts and techniques and some ideas for you. I hope those are helpful, and I am enjoying the heck out of doing these, so we'll be doing another one soon. If you'd like some coaching, the info's right up there. Give me a call or send me a personal message, and we'll talk to you on the next Studio Takes.